2,000 miles away from the trench stalemate in France, another kind of war was being fought in the desert wastes and river valleys of the Middle East. An old-fashioned war, a war of small armies and large spaces, where mobility and maneuver still counted, where success or failure depended not on millions of men, not on the massed products of industry, but on the personality and leadership of generals, where cavalry was not an out-of-date spectator of vast killing matches, but the vital instrument of fast-moving offensives, where rivers were the lifelines of the armies, as they had been in the eastern campaigns of Alexander the Great and Napoleon Bonaparte. This region was the bridge between Europe and the East, between the East and Africa. In the rich soil of its river valleys, the Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, human civilization had been born. Down the centuries, tide after tide of conquest had flowed over the Middle East. The Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Egyptians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, and the Turks. Under Turkish rule, life stagnated. Poverty and disease afflicted the people. The 19th century brought a stirring of ancient memories of nationhood to the Arabs. Men prophesied a free and united Arabia, rid of alien Turkish rule. In 1883, a French traveler noted,
"Everywhere I came upon the same abiding and universal sentiment, hatred of the Turks. The notion of concerted action to throw off the detested yoke is gradually shaping itself. An Arab movement, newly arisen, is looming in the distance, and a race hitherto downtrodden will presently claim its due place in the destinies of Islam."
Towards the end of the 19th century, another race was reviving memories of nationhood, the Jews. They had scattered across the globe after the Roman Emperor Titus had captured Jerusalem in AD 70. Now there was a movement to bring the Jewish race home again and build in Palestine a new Jewish state. The Jews began to return. The subject races of the Middle East were stirring against the bonds of the senile Turkish Empire, but the Turks still ruled over the crossroads of the world, collision point of the imperial ambitions of the European powers. The Middle East, Egypt and the Persian Gulf, was the key to the British hold on her Indian Empire. To keep the Middle East safe from France, Nelson had sunk Napoleon's fleet at the Battle of the Nile. To keep it safe from Russia, Britain had fought the Crimean War. Since its opening in 1869, the Suez Canal had become the direct route linking Britain to India and Australia and New Zealand. And since 1882, the British had been the paramount power in Egypt. The early years of the 20th century had added another reason for British concern about the Middle East: oil. In 1908, oil had been discovered in Persia, not far from the head of the Persian Gulf. In the new age of aircraft and motor transport, oil was becoming vital for Britain. The Navy, too, was changing over from coal to oil. Unlike coal, which lay safe under British fields, this new fuel was in lands that might be menaced by hostile powers. From London and from Delhi, the British continued to keep watch on the Middle East. The eyes of the German Empire were also fixed on the head of the Persian Gulf. Through the Balkans, through Turkey itself, and across the sands of Mesopotamia, there lay Germany's road to the east, a road for her busy salesmen and industrialists. The Berlin to Baghdad Railway. By 1914, all but 400 miles had been completed. Germany's interest in the Middle East had been proclaimed by the Kaiser's state visit to Turkey and the Holy Land in 1898.
His Majesty the Sultan and the 300 million Muslims who revere him as Caliph may rest assured that they will always have a friend in the German Emperor.
When the Kaiser visited Turkey again, 19 years later, the war between the nations of Europe had engulfed Turks and Arabs and Jews and Egyptians alike. But he had redeemed his promise. In 1914, Germany gave Turkey the warships Goeben and Breslau to replace 2 Turkish ships being built in British yards and seized for the Royal Navy. Britain's act of seizure and Germany's gesture of friendship pulled Turkey from neutrality into war. In Constantinople, the crowds were in holiday mood. But the Kaiser saw them, and all their fellow Muslims everywhere, as a means of destroying Britain's Indian Empire, that empire which tormented him with envy.
We must inflame the whole Mohammedan world to frantic rebellion against this detestable, treacherous, conscienceless nation of shopkeepers. For if we are to bleed to death, England shall at all events lose India.
Turkey went to war with a German-trained, German-equipped and German-advised army, recruited from some of the toughest fighting stock in the world. Which way would the Turks march? Across the Sinai Desert to the Suez Canal, down the Tigris and Euphrates to the oil fields of Persia? For the British, the loss of either would have been a catastrophe. In London and Delhi, orders were given. Convoys of troops sailed to parry the Turkish threat. Indians and Australians and New Zealanders to Egypt, British and Indians to the Persian Gulf. The expedition from India landed at the head of the Gulf and marched on to capture Basra, the Turkish port where the great rivers Tigris and Euphrates flowed sluggishly to the sea. The army discovered Mesopotamia, where even the towns were crumbling heaps of mud houses. An Arab proverb said,
"When Allah had made hell, he found it not bad enough. So he made Mesopotamia and added flies."
Gradually, a primitive base was built up amid the palm groves of Basra. More troops arrived to share the flies and the dysentery. The oil fields were safe. There seemed nothing more for the army to do. But its new commander, Lieutenant General Sir John Nixon, was not a man to rest on the defensive.
General Nixon had a well-earned reputation for dash, and he himself was under the impression that he had been selected for command largely on account of this particular characteristic.
Nixon dispatched a British and Indian force northwestwards to find and defeat the Turks. Through the spring floods of 1915, between and along the great rivers, the army labored slowly forward towards Baghdad. In country where an army must provide for itself, everything had to be improvised. Transport, medical care, hospitals. It was the rainy season and the rivers were in flood. For transport, the British used small native boats called bellums. Gunboats protected the advance, just as they had protected Kitchener's advance up the Nile in 1898. But unlike Kitchener, the British were not building a railway line behind them. By June, the army was at Amara, 200 miles away from its base at Basra. So far, the Turks had been beaten easily. Should the British press on, Nixon asked the government at home for instructions. The government were dazzled by the easy successes, by the name of Baghdad. They told Nixon to march on, if he thought the risks acceptable. Ever optimistic, Nixon ordered the force commander, General Townsend, to advance. Townsend, too, was a man with Napoleonic aspirations. While his troops marched or rested or battled with the flies and mosquitoes, he decided to try a stroke of daring.
I told Sir John Nixon that if I routed the Turks in battle, I might follow them into Baghdad. The political officer told me that if I went into Baghdad, it would have almost the same political importance as if I were to enter Constantinople. The news would go through all Asia.
Constantinople, Baghdad, cities of legend. The lure of Baghdad blinded soldiers and politicians alike to the squalid reality of 20th century Mesopotamia in midsummer, to the weakness of the link with far-off Basra, a link strained to breaking point by the hordes of filthy and hungry refugees who were fleeing from the iron clamor of a foreigner's war. It was 1915, the summer of the battles of Artois and Neuve-Chapelle in France. The sun glared down on the troops round Amara. Water that teemed with germs of every kind had to be purified before it could be safely drunk. And in the heat, men and beasts craved for water. The day temperature reached 125 degrees Fahrenheit. Disease swept the army. With contaminated water came dysentery and cholera. With the rats and the lice came plague and typhus. With the insects came sandfly fever and mosquito-borne malaria. Above all, there was the crushing, annihilating heat.
I had malaria, and I was looking in this window at the back of me, a room full of young men, great, strong young fellows, all dying slowly of heat stroke.
Further and further up the turgid rivers, further and further into the heat and emptiness, Townsend's men advanced. Now Townsend himself began to feel qualms.
The army commander does not seem to realize the weakness and danger of his line of communications. We are now some 380 miles from the sea.
With the capture of Kut el Amara, just another Arab mud town on the river, Townsend halted to rest and build up supplies. Back in Basra, Nixon was still confident. He telegraphed to India.
I consider I am strong enough to open the road to Baghdad.
November 1915. Once more, Townsend's weary men plodded north along the river. Behind them ambled a transport column that belonged not to the 20th century, but to the campaigns of Alexander or Xerxes. 620 camels, 240 donkeys, 1,000 mules, 660 carts, a collection of bullocks and cows, and a strange regatta of river craft. At last, Townsend came up with the main Turkish army, only 16 miles from Baghdad, but nearly 500 from Basra. The Turks lay entrenched in the plain, where only the great ruined arch of the ancient palace of Ctesiphon broke the flat horizons.
But when we come into the 300 yards mark, they opened a pretty heavy lot of shooting. Quite a lot of our fellas had got it. I think, about half the regiment went wiped out there on that vital points there. Well, we carried on. We captured that first line. The Turks had all gone away from it. We captured the points we was after. And they'd gone on to line number 2. Well, we couldn't go on no further.
It was a victory, but a victory that cost nearly half the British strength in infantry. The Turks had been reinforced. Townsend was 500 miles from his base, outnumbered, cumbered with sick and wounded. He faced disaster. The army fell back. For the sick and wounded now began a journey whose horror and agony recalled the Crimea.
Jolted over the rough desert in the springless, cushionless army transport carts, wounded men with broken limbs threw themselves out and crawled across the desert on hands and knees rather than endure the agony of the shaking, or use dead bodies as cushions between them and the bottom of the carts.
Worse was to come. Packed into riverboats, the wounded lay without medical aid for days until they reached Basra.
The patients were so huddled and crowded together that they could not perform the offices of nature clear of the edge of the ship, and the whole of the ship's side was covered with stalactites of human feces. Then we found a mass of men huddled up anyhow, some with blankets and some without. They were lying in a pool of dysentery about 30 feet square, covered with dysentery and dejecta generally from head to foot. The first man I examined had a fractured thigh, perforated in 5 or 6 places. He'd apparently been writhing about on the deck.
On the 3rd of December 1915, Townsend found shelter in the town of Kut. Soon he was cut off and besieged by the Turks.
I have shut myself up in Kut. The state of extreme weariness and exhaustion of my men demands instant rest.
On Christmas Eve, they got quite a number of the troops in front of us, and they started at dawn on an attack. They blew different holes in our walls. They got in, we counter-attacked, drove them out again, I suppose about, well, quite half a dozen times. They broke in at different places and we drove them out.
In January 1916, fresh troops from Basra fought desperate battles to try to break through and relieve Kut. Instead of the summer's heat, winter brought floods, torrential rains, bitter cold. Once more, supplies and medical care were improvised, inadequate. The months dragged on. The relief attacks failed with heavy losses. In Kut itself, hope grew dim.
The rations came down finally to 3 ounces of bread and 12 ounces of horse meat. The horse meat is very difficult to eat because some of these mules we ate had already been fed on mules themselves, and the meat was very lean and hard to digest.
After 5 months, on the 29th of April 1916, Kut surrendered, and General Townsend and 13,000 men, British and Indian, went into Turkish captivity. Capture did not end the prisoners' sufferings. Painful marches, thirst and hunger, brutal treatment lay ahead. 2/3 of them were to die in captivity. The fall of Kut released Turkish reserves. In 1915, feeble Turkish attacks on the Suez Canal had been easily repulsed. Now, in August 1916, the Turks launched a major offensive in Egypt. Half their force was destroyed and the rest retreated into Palestine. Egypt and the Suez Canal were secure. The British commander in Egypt, Sir Archibald Murray, wanted to crown his success with a victorious counterstroke. Stage by stage, the British in Egypt were drawn into a major campaign for the conquest of the Holy Land. Across the Sinai Desert they marched, the route taken by Bonaparte in 1799. Like Bonaparte, the British government allowed themselves to be dazzled by the names of fabulous cities, holy places that had lured European soldiers since the Crusades, Jerusalem and Damascus. This too was a war for old-fashioned objectives, but it was fought with modern means. A wire netting track for vehicles was laid across the wastes of sand, and a pipeline to bring up the water, without which the men and beasts of the army could not live. Mile by mile, a railway was laid behind the army, linking it with its base in the Nile Delta. By March 1917, Murray was through the desert and at the gates of Palestine. Murray's mounted regiments, British, Australian, New Zealand and Indian, were the key to his plan of attack on the Turkish defenses.
Our particular job was to follow through with the light horse and get the other side of Gaza and come round towards the sea, kind of so that the Turks were actually enclosed. They had the sea on one side of them and troops all round them.
In the confusion of battle, the British thought they had failed, when in fact the Turks were on the edge of defeat.
There was a withdrawal, and we went back a short way for the night, much to our disappointment because the objectives had been reached. But the disappointment and dismay and bewilderment was all the greater the next morning when we'd found we'd got to do it all over again.
The Second Battle of Gaza was a bloody British repulse. As Kut had ended Nixon's command, Gaza ended Murray's. The Turks still barred the road to Jerusalem and Damascus. The British and Australian troops settled down for a long wait in the empty, scorching wastes of the Sinai.